The Dark Contract. It was the early 2000s in a city whose name I prefer not to reveal. I, a simple truck driver, could never have imagined that my life was about to change drastically, plunging me into a world of dark rituals and human sacrifices. It all began when a mayoral candidate showed up at the transportation company where I had worked for years. She was young and beautiful, but there was something unsettling in her eyes. For days, we saw her talking with our boss and other important employees. No one knew exactly what she wanted from a transportation company like ours. One day she approached us, the drivers, saying she needed to assign an extremely important task to 3 of us. She mentioned a considerable amount of money for those chosen if they completed the task. When we asked about the job, she just smiled and said we would only know if we were selected. That night, returning from my route, I saw the candidate talking to one of my colleagues. I thought he must have been one of the lucky ones chosen. I went home, my mind buzzing with curiosity about what kind of job a mayoral candidate could want from us. The next morning, I found that colleague at the company. When I asked if he had been chosen, he confirmed but refused to reveal any details about the job. Shortly after, our boss appeared and sent him home, changing his route to the night shift, something unprecedented at the company. I spent the whole day doing my usual route, but when I returned that night, I was surprised. My boss and the candidate were waiting for me. She informed me that I was the last one selected and asked to speak with me privately. It was then that she asked the question that would change everything. What would you be willing to do for the amount I mentioned? The sum was astronomical, enough to buy a new house without a second thought. Impulsively, I replied that I would do anything. Her smile widened as she asked if I would be willing to assault, deprive someone of freedom, or witness a ritual. I fell silent, shocked. She emphasized the importance of secrecy, threatening terrible consequences if I spoke up. Feeling cornered, I agreed to keep it secret. She then pulled out a blank sheet of paper with a red line at the bottom and asked me to sign it. She explained that by signing, I was giving up any possibility of backing out, and that failure would mean putting my life and that of my loved ones in grave danger. With trembling hands, I took the luxurious pen she offered and signed the blank contract. At that moment, unknowingly, I had sealed my fate and embarked on a dark journey that would haunt me for the rest of my days. After signing the contract, the candidate instructed me to report to the company the next night, ignoring my normal schedule. She stressed the importance of absolute secrecy, forbidding me from telling anyone, including my family. The next night, I arrived at the company as agreed. The candidate greeted me with a disturbing smile, saying that the other 2 selected were doing their parts elsewhere, but that my delivery was the most important. She and my boss led me to my truck, informing me that the cargo was already loaded. When I expressed the desire to check the load, the candidate intervened, claiming it was better for my mental health not to see. Reluctantly, I agreed. The destination was not a city, but an isolated farm. The candidate instructed me to wait at least 4 hours after delivery before returning, assuring me that I would be well treated. I set off, trying to convince myself that it was just a relaxed workday with an exorbitant payment. During the journey, I couldn't help but speculate about the nature of the cargo. The destination seemed to be a place of great wealth, which made me wonder why such a well-connected candidate would need secret deliveries. An hour away from the destination, I began to hear a subtle noise coming from the back of the truck. Initially, it seemed distant and almost imperceptible. When I finally stopped and opened the rear doors, I was shocked by what I saw. The cargo compartment was practically empty except for a small cradle tied at the back. Inside it, a few-month-old baby was crying uncontrollably. My body trembled, and I fell to my knees, recalling the candidate's words about needing the stomach for this. My mind raced, imagining terrible scenarios: kidnapping, extortion, child trafficking. I wanted to do something, to save that innocent child, but the candidate's threats echoed in my mind. With a heavy heart and growing nausea, I closed the doors, ignoring the baby's cries, and continued my journey. Along the way, I had to stop several times to vomit. The guilt and horror of what I was doing consumed me. I arrived at the farm's entrance, where armed men checked my identity before letting me in. The property was exactly as I imagined, a grand mansion surrounded by vast lands. I parked where indicated, and two men in suits, accompanied by armed guards, approached. They opened the back of the truck and, without showing any emotion, removed the baby and the cradle. They reminded me once again of the importance of silence and informed me when I should leave. They offered me food and even access to the pool, but I was too nauseous to accept anything. I decided to stay in the truck, watching the house and counting the minutes until I could leave. Shortly after, a man brought a bag with my payment, more than initially promised. He mentioned that the extra was for not asking questions and not minding that it was a baby. His words only worsened my emotional state. What happened next will be forever etched in my memory. What I saw next made me freeze. All the farm employees suddenly entered the house, leaving the place deserted. Driven by a morbid curiosity, I got out of the truck and cautiously approached the back of the mansion. There, I saw something I will never forget. The baby was lying on a black sheet, surrounded by a pentagram and other strange symbols. Strangely, there was no one around. The most disturbing part was that, although I could still hear the crying, the baby seemed completely motionless. Terrified, I ran back to the truck. My mind tried to rationalize what I had seen, but nothing made sense. The crying stopped about 2 hours later, and the employees began to leave the house again. When it was finally time to leave, I didn't hesitate. I drove back to the company as fast as possible, desperate to get away from that dark place. Upon arrival, I was greeted by the candidate and my boss. She congratulated me on a splendid job, but mentioned she couldn't say the same for the other two chosen ones. Intrigued and fearful, I asked what she meant. The candidate just smiled enigmatically and dismissed me. My boss, with a somber expression, nodded, indicating that I should go. At home, I turned on the TV and was horrified to see a news report about my two colleagues who had also been chosen. Their bodies were found in city dumps, in a state I prefer not to describe. I understood that they had probably disobeyed the candidate's orders and paid the ultimate price. I couldn't sleep. The baby's crying echoed in my mind, and sometimes I saw it beside my bed. Guilt and fear consumed me. When I thought my torment couldn't get worse, I received a call on the third day. It was my boss, informing me that the candidate had the next job for me. My heart sank. I knew I couldn't refuse. The consequences would be fatal. I arrived at the company in the afternoon, where the candidate received me. She assured me that this time it wouldn't be a baby, but warned that the task wouldn't be any easier. The new job involved picking up a disoriented young man on the road and taking him to the same farm. The candidate explained the plan in detail, emphasizing the importance of discretion. As she spoke, I realized I was sinking deeper and deeper into a world of darkness from which I might never escape. With a heavy heart and a tormented mind, I prepared for another night that promised to test the limits of my conscience and humanity. With a heavy heart, I set off for my new mission. The night was dark and cold, reflecting the emptiness I felt inside. After a few hours on the deserted road, I spotted the lone figure of a young man desperately waving for help. I parked the truck and opened the door. The boy, clearly disoriented and possibly under the influence of substances, begged with tears in his eyes to take him to a hospital or back to his family. His desperation was palpable and made my stomach churn. As we drove, he told me his story. He was at a party with friends when they decided to go for a walk. Suddenly, his so-called friends abandoned him by the roadside. The young man shared that his girlfriend was pregnant and that he feared dying without meeting his child. His words hit me like a punch. I was about to deliver this future father to the same terrible fate as the baby the previous night. For a moment, I considered turning back and saving him, but the fear of the consequences paralyzed me. As we approached the farm's entrance, the boy realized something was wrong. He began to beg me, grabbing my arm desperately. The guards opened the door and dragged him out while he screamed for mercy. I parked the truck in the usual spot, watching helplessly as they took him to the back of the property. The ritual that followed was even more disturbing than the previous one. They tied the young man to a wooden stake, and hooded people painted symbols on his body. They stepped back, and then I witnessed something that defied logic. The boy began to convulse violently, his superhuman strength breaking the ropes that bound him. He fell to his knees, screaming to the sky, while a red liquid gushed from his mouth. Moments later, he collapsed lifeless. No one approached for hours, as if they were waiting for something else to happen. When they finally handed me the payment and I could leave, I drove as if fleeing from hell itself. At the company, the candidate greeted me with a kiss on the lips, praising my performance and lamenting the fate of the other 2 drivers who had failed. She informed me that there would be a third and final delivery in 2 days. Her words, which should have brought relief, only increased my dread. What could be worse than what I had already witnessed? The following 2 nights were tormenting. The baby's cries and the young man's screams haunted me. I contemplated fleeing the country with the money I had earned, but fear for my family's safety held me back. When the time for the 3rd delivery arrived, I was on the verge of a nervous breakdown. But what the candidate asked of me this time surpassed all the limits I thought still existed in my shattered conscience. On the night of the 3rd delivery, I met with the candidate again. Her smile was cold as she handed me a loaded gun. My heart froze upon hearing her instructions. My task was to follow a specific car with 4 occupants. Once they were far enough from the city, I was to cause an accident by ramming the vehicle from behind. The objective: capture the small child in the car and take her to the farm. The candidate emphasized that the girl should not be harmed in the accident. My mind went into panic. This was premeditated murder. Child kidnapping. I would be directly responsible for taking innocent lives. I wanted to refuse, scream, flee. But the fear from previous threats paralyzed me. With trembling hands, I took the gun and headed to the highway. I spotted the target car and began to follow it discreetly. Each mile traveled increased my anguish. I watched the people in the car, a happy family, unaware of the terrible fate awaiting them because of me. When we reached an isolated stretch of road, I knew it was time. I accelerated, aiming at the rear of the vehicle. At the last second, I hesitated. But it was too late. The impact was violent. The car skidded and flipped off the road. I stopped and ran to the wreckage, my heart pounding frantically. The driver and front passenger did not survive the impact. In the back seat, I found the scared little girl and a teenager. The young girl begged me not to take the child. In a moment of pure despair and fear, I raised the gun and shot the teenager. The sound of the shot echoed in the night, sealing my fate as a murderer. I took the girl, who was screaming and struggling, and put her in the truck. Throughout the entire trip to the farm, she cried and begged to go back to her family. Every word she said was a dagger in my already torn conscience. Upon arriving at the farm, I handed the child over to the men waiting for me. The candidate was there, smiling with satisfaction. She gave me an amount of money larger than the previous ones, praising my efficiency. I watched, paralyzed, as they prepared the girl for the ritual. The scene that followed was one of indescribable cruelty. The child, tied up, started to laugh hysterically, speaking in an unknown language before falling silent. Those present celebrated as if it were a great victory. I left the farm feeling completely empty, a mere shell of the man I used to be. The weight of my actions crushed me. I had crossed a line from which there was no return. Upon arriving at the farm, I handed the child to the men waiting for me. The candidate was there, smiling with satisfaction. She gave me a larger sum of money than before, praising my efficiency. I stood paralyzed as they prepared the girl for the ritual. The scene that followed was of indescribable cruelty. The child, tied up, began to laugh hysterically, speaking in an unknown language before becoming still. Those present celebrated as if it were a great victory. I left the farm feeling completely empty, a mere shell of the man I used to be. The weight of my actions crushed me. I had crossed a line from which there was no return. In the days that followed, my life became a waking nightmare. The images of the 3 deliveries haunted me constantly. The baby's cry, the young boy's screams, and the girl's macabre laughter echoed in my mind, giving me no peace. When the elections finally came, the candidate won by a surprising margin. Her smiling face on posters and TV made me nauseous. I knew the bloody price of her victory. A few days after the election, my boss called me for a private conversation. With a pale face and trembling voice, he revealed the truth behind everything that had happened. "It's not just here," he said. "Many mayors, governors, even people in higher positions, they're all involved in this. These sacrifices are the source of their power." Shocked, I asked why the victims had to be so specific: a baby, a young boy, a child. My boss hesitated before responding. "The demon that grants them power, it has its demands. Innocence, potential, purity. Each sacrifice serves a purpose." The realization of the cosmic horror I was involved in hit me with full force. It wasn't just corrupt politicians, but a supernatural conspiracy stretching across the country, perhaps the world. "And why me?" I asked, my voice barely audible. "They always choose an outsider to do the dirty work. Someone who can be easily discarded if things go wrong." I left that conversation feeling that the world I knew had crumbled. The streets, the people, everything seemed different now that I knew the dark truth hiding behind the facade of normality. In the months and years that followed, I watched with knowing eyes the politicians rising to power. Every surprising electoral victory, every inexplicable decision, all now had a new meaning for me. I often thought of denouncing, telling the world what I had witnessed. But who would believe me? And even if they did, how far did the power of this demonic conspiracy reach? So, I remained silent. I carried my burden in silence, tormented by memories and guilt. The money I earned remained untouched. Using it felt like an even greater desecration. Today, years later, I decided to share my story. Not for absolution. I know I don't deserve forgiveness for what I've done. But as a warning. A reminder that behind the curtains of power lies a darkness deeper and older than we can imagine. And to those who, like me, one day find themselves facing an impossible choice, remember, there are things worse than death. There are secrets that, once known, poison the very soul. As I write these words, I don't know how much longer I will live. But if this story reaches you, know that it is true. And be vigilant, for the evil I witnessed is still out there, waiting for its next victim.